In a literal sense, wars are won or lost on the battlefield. But what happens there is largely determined by more mundane things, like logistics, and an even simpler question of who has more money. And it is that latter point that is in the news right now. On June 13th, the West made a major cash play by figuring out a clever way to send $50 billion in new aid to Ukraine. Note that that is on top of the $61 billion that the United States earmarked for the war back in April. And somehow, Russia will be the one footing the bill, all without creating too much extra incentive for Russia to prolong the war. Put differently, Ukraine is about to be flush with the resources to sustain itself over the long run, definitely into 2025, and perhaps longer. To understand where the $50 billion will magically come from, let's rewind back to February 2022. In its haste to invade Ukraine without drawing the suspicions of Western countries, and also with a lack of better places to put the assets, Russia poured troops over the border while keeping about $300 billion tucked away in Western financial institutions. The Kremlin failed to obtain a lightning victory, and in an ironic twist, the Fortress Russia funds were soon locked down by the West. Last we heard from the US government itself, we still did not really know how the $300 billion is divided. The United States probably only has 1 or 2% of it. Meanwhile, Belgium has about $190 billion, and it seems likely that France and Germany have the rest. We also do not know exactly what the true total is either. Once upon a time, $300 billion was indeed the most used number. The announcement of the new strategy has changed that, though. Now $260 billion is the number that is most frequently cited. But whatever the true amount is, that money basically just sat there for 2 years accruing interest. Then, in April 2024, murmurs began that the West was going to make a play on it. In fact, the mega deal in Congress from that month not only included $61 billion in aid to assist Ukraine, it also included a provision for the president to begin working with European allies to come up with a plan for seizing the assets. That is a lot of reading over there, so for those of us who do not care that much, here's a cute dog. Aww. Moving along, in the wake of that bill, we previously discussed the main issues with confiscation. Oh, and we also highlighted the G7 meeting beginning on June 13th as a likely time for the decision to be made. Hold that thought for a minute. Anyway, the first issue with Russia also seizing Western assets, and the second issue of scaring other rogue states from using Western financial systems, are just costs that the West is going to have to absorb. The lost coercive leverage was the bigger problem. This is the idea that any sort of peaceful resolution to the war must give Russia at least what it expects to obtain by continuing to fight. That is a combination of how much it expects to capture, like this hypothetical amount, minus the cost it will suffer in the process, represented by the space between these two lines. That is because, by definition, Russia gets a value out to here by continuing the war. So either the settlement needs to make concessions at least to here, or the West needs to figure out a way to push the red line further back. Therein lies the problem. If the frozen assets are permanently seized, then the Kremlin will no longer make them a part of its cost calculation. In turn, Kyiv cannot use the assets as leverage in coercive negotiations, and settling the territorial conflict on favorable terms will be more difficult, even if those veins are a little intimidating. Or, visually, Russia's literal and metaphorical red line shifts westward. Two of the solutions floated to solve those problems were to use the money to empower Ukraine, and to only seize interest accrued on the principal. The former option works better. Yes, it shrinks Russia's costs, but it also shifts the expected outcome of the war favorably for Ukraine. So that could be a net positive from Kyiv's perspective. The second option is not as good. Taking away the interest payments within the accounts effectively decreases the amount of leverage that the West holds over Russia year after year. So not touching those funds equivalently increases the West's coercive leverage every year. Okay, that covers the background of everything important that happened before June 13th. On that day, the G7 leaders convened in Italy for their 50th annual summit. And when they were not otherwise distracted by taking their traditional family photo, admiring Justin Trudeau's perennially crisp lines on pants, and attempting to solve the world's infrastructure problems, they announced a coordinated plan for the frozen Russian assets. Forewarning, this is breaking news, so I am going to do my best to tell you what we know. But the details here are still a little murky, and thus subject to change. In short, the United States will offer Ukraine a $50 billion loan, with the expectation that European countries will join in to split the principal given. The money will go to, among other things, military aid to keep Ukraine competitive in the war. Note the word loan, though. This is in contrast to the $61 billion from the congressional aid package. Some of the money there went to rebuilding U.S. arms production infrastructure that had dissipated after the end of the Cold War. Other portions were earmarked to pay for new armaments and for Ukraine to receive the United States' outdated surplus. Thus, none of that came with the expectation of any repayment. Loans, however, do require repayment. That makes them politically easier to accept, which is a key selling point for both congressional Republicans and the once and potentially future President Trump. Now, loans also see interest payments accrue over time, and if you want to have lower interest payments, then you need to offer some sort of collateral. For example, banks offer mortgages, literally death pledges, with lower interest payments than what you can get with a basic personal loan. The bank is okay with this because it still receives monthly checks from you, and if you ever do stop paying, the lender can simply seize your now former house. Thus, the loan is low risk from the lender's perspective. What you are really paying for is the time value of money. This is where the G7 started to get creative. What if you used Russia's assets as the collateral? Specifically, the G7 is using the interest on the $300-ish billion principal in that regard. I suspect the reason why it is just the interest being used here, and not the principal, is because they are still trying to avoid setting the precedent that anyone's principal could be lost via sanctions. Don't want to scare China out of the markets. In any case, if the loan were to ever default, then the lenders can recoup some of their losses by seizing the accrued interest. Now, how might such a default occur? Well, given the terms I have described so far, it seems that we have a perverse incentive. Kyiv would just want to immediately induce an intentional default. That would give them the $50 billion, and yet it would still force the West to seize the Russian interest. Sounds like a win-win if you are on the downstream side of an invasion. Well, the G7 is a step ahead of that. The interest payments on the loan are not going to be paid by Ukraine. Instead, they already come from the accrued interest on the frozen Fortress Russia assets. And using the supreme quantitative skills that I learned while in grad school, a $50 billion loan is less than the $300-ish billion Russian principal currently frozen, so there is more than enough to cover it. And just to confirm that the money is actually accruing interest, and not literally just sitting in a vault somewhere, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, in an op-ed advocating for the plan, simply described the interest amount as billions per year. But whatever the exact amount is, seizure will result in the minor decline in coercive bargaining power mentioned earlier. However, because the interest is being used to fund a much, much larger loan, one would imagine that the shift in military power will more than offset the lower Russian war cost. Now, we still have not gotten to the really clever part. One of the ways that the loan could de facto default is if Ukraine ceases to exist, overlooking the unlikely event that a meteor goes smashing directly into that area of Europe. The most probable cause there would be a complete Russian takeover of the country. So, what is likely being communicated behind the scenes is the threat to Russia, that if anything like that were to happen, suddenly all of that money would be gone. And it would not require any new rules to be put into place either. Those already are the terms of the loan. That is a tricky way to use the assets, while also not inadvertently increasing Russian bargaining power. Now, what happens to the principal of the loan if a settlement is reached remains unclear. Do not be surprised if the United States ends up eating some portion of it. Such a move would just be paying what is known as a peace subsidy with extra steps, and they are known to be effective means of conflict mediation. In any case, in a game of chicken, it pays to be the person who forces the other side to move last, and the G7 plan is effectively doing just that. Meanwhile, if you like chicken, you will love my books about the war in Ukraine. You will also love them if you don't like chicken. Those two things basically have nothing to do with each other, even though chicken somehow keeps showing up in these videos. But anyway, check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.